thank you all for coming. A couple of comments. I want to first thank Dr. Bennett, who has become the sort of MC of these events, but has also been contributing greatly to helping to form, structure, and direct, as well as keep us relatively speaking on time and schedule. And very, very much, as I jokingly say, in the tradition of Reich, where by all accounts, nothing ever started, late with Dr. Reich. You did it, when he said, and that was that. And you didn't come in if you were late. So everyone was there. Unable to follow up on that, we use Dr. Bennett as close as we can.
Are you saying I'm like Reich?
Well, I'm sure you want to hear it that way, but I'll just say that you're greatly helpful. And Kevin Hinchy, who graciously has been really supportive in coming and bringing a very important perspective in terms of connection to the archives, and also the only group that really sustains a connection with the legacy that Reich left, much of which, as we see, still is vital and lively and energetic, which is a lead into my topic, but still remains largely not accessed adequately, to say the least. I want to, along with Dr. Bennett's handout, Kevin Hinchy didn't have any handouts, but that was
He's actually looking for a handout.
You can go online. This is a sheet which basically is my presentation, so I can leave now. It's probably better than my presentation. Yeah, I worked on it.
You're going to have to explain it a little
Yes,
bit.
yeah, I will.
Some more?
Need some more back here.
Yeah, you have some others?
We're not getting any. What, we chop cheese here? We chop it. We don't get it?
Oh, yeah. You guys?
I had some.
That's okay.
So the first two presentations really, I think, give a very good historical, which is the way we've begun to think of how to do this, have placed it in the topic in a very, very, I think, sound historical grounding in terms of where Dr. Reich, generated his work and activities. One comment I want to make in follow-up is that I think what is often really lost is that in the late 20s into the 30s, the movement and the youth movement, I may comment on it, but to emphasize it again, was central to Reich's work, not only in terms of the sex poll and public meetings, but also in terms of schools, communes, those they call the sex communes, and various other organizations, including some of the clinical organizations and clinical research that Reich was doing about the nature and function of sexuality. So I think central to my presentation is the idea that you can't really understand the issue of, it's easy enough to take the topic adolescence and adolescent sexuality, or the struggle for, sexual rights of youth as a topic, but to really understand it, you have to place it in the context of an understanding of Reich's fundamental research and fundamental interest in the nature and function of energy and the nature and function of biological energy in the living organism, and what happens when that energy is in some way blocked, altered, or diverted, or prevented from a natural expression. Interestingly, recently with one of my students, we've been reading literally going line by line, which is extremely valuable, through character analysis, and fascinating to look. And I think one of the values of both what Kevin Hinchy is presenting and Phil Bennett are presenting is the fact that when you read Reich, even as early as the 30s, right, the basic fundamental issues are already clear. So even reading in in psychoanalytically grounded material, the discussion of energy and what happens to energy when it is, it is diverted or not allowed a healthy, normal economic, pulsation or motility, is central even as early as the early editions of character analysis. That said, my presentation then is on energy, and then my conception was that if you follow this out, that energy expresses itself in various ways. Energy in general, I mean cosmic energy, but once we get into the nature and function of energy in living matter, and particularly in humans, right? We look then eventually at its expression, as Reich will point out, as the function of the orgasm. What happens if that function is in some way altered or manipulated in a particular circumstance? What this leads to in terms of the nature and function of anxiety. And then for me, in terms of this topic today, or the subject today, what happens when that energy is diverted to a point where it begins to be organized in a social and cultural context. Now, when we get to the diagram, which I will begin to go through, and as basically the guide to what I want to talk about, is when I refer to sociocultural, it's extremely important to understand that it might be a little bit arcane, but culture, in terms of sociocultural, culture is not really separate from culture. It's from society. Culture is simply the means that society transmits what you need to know to be a member. Okay? I do a whole lecture on this with my students in the anthropology areas, but basically everything you need to know to be a member is culture. And so in simple terms, that's what culture is. So culture in some ways is extremely important. A lot of what the talk about early in some of the quotes from Reich is about what happens, and a lot of the subject matter about issues of age of consent. This is all social manifestations of cultural norms, cultural attitudes, things you need to know to be a member. Not necessarily things that you like, but what kids are being told constantly is you want to be a member, you got to know, you got to do this. You don't do that, you do this. And how you organize that will be the result, will express how successful you are in the culture. Right? Some of that's, then you get into issues of, juridical culture, meaning the rules and regulations versus what everyone else knows. So everybody in New York, as I always point out, knows that you see a red light, the juridical culture is you stop and you wait until it's proper to proceed. But everyone else knows that the public culture is that, well, if you could get away with it and there's no camera, you can do it, okay? So with that in mind, so when you see the references to sociocultural in my talk, is to understand that culture is really only a way of transmitting information or organizing information about how we do society, right? And that can vary. So my initial premise was that for Reich, all experience basically is fundamentally driven by and the result of energy. And in our terms, and I think it's also incredibly important to state, that here we're talking about not a metaphor, not a concept of energy as some sort of general, useful, reference, but literal energy. And as we, most of us participating here, would be understand me, we're talking about orgone energy. Literally, the energy that Reich discovered and materially collected and demonstrated the function of, okay, and explored for pretty much the last 30 years of his career, if not longer. It's fascinating as we go through the archives how early he was beginning to really be aware of